Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Daphne Lazar-Price, and I'm the Executive Director of JOFA, and I want to welcome you all this evening. It is my distinct privilege to, I'm sorry, give me 1 second, because now I'm having my own technical difficulties. It is my distinct privilege and pleasure to welcome Evonne Marzouk, who's going to be leading us in a webinar titled Exploring, Exploring the Feminine Jewish Superhero. Pardon me. A word about Evonne. Evonne, who by the way is a longtime friend and neighbor, and this is a perfect example of practicing social distancing, because if this weren't in the time of the times that we're in, Evonne and I should be sitting next to each other and talking about this in our living room over coffee and tea and being close with one another. And so this is actually best practices of social distancing, even though we're just around the corner from each other. Evonne has spent her career in pursuit of inspiring others, making a difference, and bringing Jewish wisdom into the world. She grew up in Philadelphia and began writing and publishing poems and stories as a young child. Evonne attended the Johns Hopkins University and received a BA from the Writers Seminar program with a minor in religious studies. Evonne founded and is the former director of Canfei Nesharim, which recently merged with GrowTorah, an organization that teaches Jewish wisdom about protecting the environment. Evonne began work for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1999 and has played her roles and work on the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. Evonne, help me with the pronunciation of this.
Minamata, sorry.
Thank you. The Minamata Convention on Mercury and the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. And throughout all of these activities, publishing a novel has been one of Evonne's lifelong dreams. She's incredibly grateful and sometimes amazed that this moment has finally arrived. I have to say that I watched this from a distance, and Evonne handed me a copy over coffee at Starbucks 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and I took the book home and I read it over Shabbos, and I'm so excited that she's here to share with us her wisdom. Evonne, one quick question: what has been your favorite item of clothing during this time of social distancing?
My denim skirt.
So Evonne's going to answer the questions of what does our society lose when it undervalues traditional feminine powers of insight, intuition, empathy, and emotional strength, and what can we gain by owning feminine stories and strengths. This webinar is going to explore what our society could gain by valuing traditionally feminine powers of insight and intuition, empathy, and emotional strength as explored in Evonne's new novel, The Prophetess. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you for a little bit.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I know it's such a challenging moment in the world, and I'm just honored for everyone who's here and everyone who's listening online and everyone who joins in later. I'm just so honored that you've all made your evening to be here and spend time talking about this. I'm really excited to share with you some things that I've learned. So my plan is for us to explore some ideas that will make a difference for each of us as women in recognizing our own stories and how we can grow into our gifts. And first, I'd like to share a little bit about why I wrote The Prophetess, which was for me a 20-year labor of love in trying to put something into the world that I found missing when I was a young woman. So then I'll share with you this cool thing that I learned about while writing The Prophetess about the difference between the male and female hero journeys in our culture. And I think what I learned is relevant not just for this one story, but for all of us in our own stories. And I'm excited to get to share that with you. And I'd be happy to answer questions, and you can put them in the chat or in the Facebook Live, wherever you are. And I'll try to get through whatever questions, if there are any in the article. And I know it's challenging with the technology, but I'd love to make this interactive. So I'm eager for your participation if you can, and I'd encourage you to participate through the chat box or through Facebook Live. And if what I share tonight inspires you or speaks to you, I do encourage you to get a copy of The Prophetess and read it. It's available in hardcover and Kindle editions on Amazon, and it should be available in your local library system. And if not, you can request it. It's in a lot of library systems so far. So, and I've also developed a draft teacher's guide for educators who would like to teach this book in Jewish day schools or Hebrew schools. And I'd love to get to know a teacher who'd like to pilot it with me. So if that's you, I'd love to talk to you about that. So I want to share with you about why I wrote this book. And I think you can see in the chat there's a link to the blog that I was able to write for the JOFA blog on the day that the book was launched. And in that blog, I shared about why I wrote the book. Because when I was 17, my grandfather died. He died within a month of my high school graduation, unexpectedly in his sleep. And until that moment, I think 17-year-old me would probably have said I was doing okay. I had experienced like the usual teenage disappointments, but I had loving parents and I had been a leader in my high school youth group and I was on my way to the college of my choice. And so I was like, fine. But when my grandfather died, something deep inside of me got rocked. And I became desperate to understand more about how life works. Like, how could beloved family members just die like that? And what was the meaning of our lives? And did any part of us go on after we died? And what was really the meaning of everything? And if you have ever had a moment like that, a moment that rocked your reality when you were growing up, or even more recently, I'm totally, I'd love to have you share about that in the chat box or anywhere that you might want to share about that experience. Because I think many of us have had those experiences in our lives. And maybe we're all going through a moment like that right now with this coronavirus situation, a moment that's like just shaking our foundations and making us wonder, you know, what it's really all about and who we are and what's most important when you strip away some of the things that we're used to having in place. So anyway, when my grandfather died, I didn't really have much traditional wisdom to fall back on. Personally, I had grown up in a largely unaffiliated Jewish household. And I grew up with like this hodgepodge of American beliefs that were conveyed by my really wonderful but not Jewishly educated, unaffiliated parents. And I didn't have much access to lessons about what it could mean to live as a Jewish woman or any sense of the spiritual depths of this Jewish tradition that I was growing into. And it wasn't until my grandfather died that started to be a real problem for me. That I had questions and I really didn't know how to look for answers. I had no access to that. And so I began to search. And this is where I start to share my screen. I'm going to share my screen. Here it comes. No, that's not it. Here it is. So I started to read some books. And here are some books that you might discover when you were in a search for meaning. Here they are. I'm going to move Daphne over here. So The Celestine Prophecy, The Alchemist, Life 101, quote books, lots of quote books, Siddhartha, Conversations with God, Tao Te Ching, right? More quote books, lots and lots of those kinds of things. And I bought these quote books and I would like write down the quotes that had meaning for me. I was like, oh, I still have some of those quote books. And, you know, the thing that you might notice about this set of books is that none of them are Jewish or have really any grounding in Jewish tradition at all. And I was really looking for a book that I never really found, a Jewish book that would be written like for a young woman like me, that would gently reveal the spiritual possibilities of Judaism, a book that like could pass along a little wisdom without having to work too hard for it. It wasn't like I was going to go pick up the Talmud. And sometimes when you see something missing in the world, it becomes your job to create that. Actually, there's a mystical Jewish teaching that says that we choose our life purpose before we were born based on what we when we looked at the world before we were born, and what we saw was missing is how we chose our life purpose. And maybe you can think of something like that, something you've noticed that's missing in the world, and you feel it's your role to provide that in the world. So anyway, that's why I wrote The Prophetess, so that a book like that would be available for everyone seeking it. And I think that I hope that it will be able to provide that both for young women who are looking and also for other women, because I think that all of us still have that teenage girl still inside of us. And that I hope that The Prophetess is filling that gap for many people who've wished that they had something like that. So as a child, I always wanted to write novels. And I started this novel, The Prophetess, as a student at Johns Hopkins University over 20 years ago. So the book took quite a long time to write. And one of the major themes of The Prophetess is growing into our gifts. For me, it was a process of growing into the into writing this book itself and becoming the person I needed to be in order to tell this particular story. And maybe there's something like that for you. And I encourage you to think about it, about what it is that would be there for you, what gifts you're still growing into, what dreams you're still pursuing, what the next step is for you to grow into and fulfill that purpose and live into your gifts. So that along the way of writing this story, I came across the concept of character and story archetypes based on Jungian psychology. And I wanted to share it with you because it struck me as so interesting and important for women, because I think we don't always hear women's stories or learn about archetypal female characters. And we don't really see that in the world. And I want to share with you some of those archetypes and share with you the things that I learned about our feminine stories and about how that can help us bring our own stories and our own gifts and our own personalities into our lives and into the world. Jung believes there are certain character archetypes that represent personality patterns contained in a collective unconscious. He actually believed that there were certain types of people, and that those types of people were sort of part of an unconscious that everyone, that was part of a collective, and that everyone was sort of acting out a certain character. And his character archetypes were further developed, and they're actually the basis for the Myers-Briggs type indicator personality assessment. So it's not like they're not with us. We're using them, and many different sort of personality type assessments that you're aware of are based on these archetypes. So it's not something that's just from an old book. It's something that we're using today. And whether or not these characters exist in some human collective subconscious level, or whether they're just the basis for so many familiar stories that we learn them as children, we know them. When we hear stories with characters based on these archetypes, we immediately understand and recognize them. And we can also identify people in our own lives who fit the archetypes when we hear them. So I learned about the archetypes from this book. I don't know if my screen is, I'm probably not showing, but if I am, it's this book that's called 45 Master Characters, which elaborates the Jungian character archetypes by connecting them with characters, male and female, in Greek myths. And the author of the book, her name is Victoria Lynn Schmidt. She was a screenwriter who explained that she wrote the book out of a need for more well-developed female characters. She wrote, I'm going to take off the screen so that so I can make sure everybody can see the 45 Master Characters book. I found it to be super helpful. She wrote in the book, often it seems as if roles for female heroes could have just as easily been written for a male hero. These roles lack the nuances of the female experiences. They act like men and don't ring true. She wrote this in 2001. It doesn't seem like much has changed. It's still the case that we're seeing mostly male character archetypes played out in many of the stories that we're most familiar with. So the female, I'm going to go back to my screen share so I can show you the archetypes that she identified. So these are so one of the things that's kind of interesting is that she actually defined the archetypes both for masculine and feminine forms. So she actually distinguished between masculine and feminine in the archetypes, which Jung did not originally do. And it's been done in a few different ways, but not everyone does this, like separates out who the feminine archetypes are. And I found it to be very helpful. So the female archetypes, the characters that Schmidt identifies in her book are these: the seductive muse, known in Greek myth as Aphrodite; the Amazon, known in Greek myth as Artemis; the father's daughter, known in Greek myth as Athena; the nurturer, Demeter; the matriarch, Hera; the mystic, Hestia; the female messiah or powerful enlightened being, Isis; and the maiden, Persephone. So maybe you can even already see yourself in one of these characters, and if so, go ahead and put that in the chat box. Tell us who you are. But I'm going to say a little bit more about them. So in my novel, The Prophetess, the main character is based around the archetype, this powerful, enlightened being character. But not every use of this, so I'm going to explain it in case you happen to be familiar with people or characters that use this archetype. So not every use of this archetype is a religious one, even though it's defined as like the female messiah. You might recognize the archetype better if I tell you how this feminine savior archetype has recently been used in familiar movies, like Erin Brockovich, Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings, or Wonder Woman. They're these feminine savior characters. So this archetype needs to be connected to something greater than herself. And she has moments of clarity and bliss, but then must learn to integrate this experience with the tasks of everyday life. She doesn't place herself above anyone else, and her sense of purpose is so strong, she can do nothing else but be motivated to reach her goal. So I organized my story around the character Rachel, who follows this archetype. And I actually use the tools within this book to define her and understand her fears and gifts in that context. I also use some of the other archetypes to define other characters in my book. And I think that it's useful for us to notice these and use these archetypes and see how they play out in our lives and in stories. And sometimes only a few of these archetypes are being used over and over again, and we're very familiar with them, and others, we don't have nearly as much definition of them. And it's part of the reason that feminine characters in movies and television shows and sometimes in books sometimes show up as so thin and not, stereotypical or not really fully developed. So let me tell you a little more about the other archetypes. And as I go through them, you might see yourself in one or more of them. And I encourage you to jot down the ones that resonate with you in the chat box if you feel comfortable, so that you can use them later. And if you can think of any examples you know of from movies or books, feel free to mention them in the chat box too. So I'll just go through the others that I haven't talked about yet. So the seductive muse is one that we see in television a lot. She cares about men and secretly manipulates them with her charm. So if you've watched Sex and the City, she's a Samantha, right? And I think you could probably think of a number of different examples of this character, but I wanted to ask if you could think of an example of this in Jewish tradition. I think we've probably come up with a few characters within the whole universe of the Tanakh and beyond who fall into this category. And I had one in mind, but I wanted to ask and stop to see if anyone had any ideas that they might want to enter into the box. Cool, I can see some people writing. Oh, I see Esther. Any other thoughts? I had Esther in mind for a different one, but Tamar, very good, interesting. The one that I had in mind was Yael, brought Sisera into her house. I think we can come up with a number of examples of women who seem to do this, to sort of like have this way of seducing and manipulating men with their charm. And there's not really any, I think women often think of that as like a really, that character sometimes gets a bad rap, but it's just one of the archetypes. I'm not making any judgments, right? Delilah, good choice. So if other people have ideas, feel free to keep writing them down, and then I'm going to talk next about the Amazon. So I'm going to go back to my screen share. There we go. Okay, cool. So the Amazon cares deeply about the feminine, nature, and the earth. And she takes great pride in being able to take care of herself. So some character examples are like Jo in Little Women, Lucy in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Can you think of any Amazon, like powerfully strong, feminine women who care more about the feminine and about nature and the earth than about and not defined by men? So if anyone has any examples, you could write them down. One that I had in mind for this one was Devorah, just this, very strong feminine character who basically, kind of says, like, I'll go with you, but when I go with you, it means that, you don't get the credit because she's kind of showing the strength of a woman having the important, powerful role there. So the next one is the father's daughter. The father's daughter cares about aligning herself with powerful men. She loves to win or to see her team win, and she wants to prove that she's better than most women. She enjoys competition, especially as part of a team. So some examples that I came up with or that she provided here in her books, Murphy Brown, Dr. Cuddy in House, I thought was a good example of like one of these sort of a woman who wears the pants, so to speak. So in Jewish tradition for this, I was thinking about the Shunammite woman, somebody who just kind of like goes and does all of her, is basically fully in control. But I'm open to other suggestions. Rachel, competitive. Cool. So, so the next one is the nurturer. The nurturer's identity is wrapped up in the people she takes care of, and she tends to take on too many tasks at once, trying to please so many people and overwhelming herself. So an example for that is Belle in Beauty and the Beast. So I'm sure that you can think of a million people in your life who fit this character. But it's interesting because it's not every mother, right? There's just some people who, regardless of what their role is in a family, they're taking care of other people and sometimes taking care of other people at the expense of themselves. So that's the nurturer. So can you think of, so I actually put Rachel for this one because of not maybe in the story so much, but in the way we think of her midrashically and the way we think of her in terms of taking care of all of the Jewish people and being so emotional about that. So the matriarch is the woman in charge. I'm just moving this over. Oh, I'm going to minimize that. The matriarch is the woman in charge who sees to the needs of her family and demands respect in return. She loves to make plans and expects everyone to show up. And she means her advice as law. If she's married, she may feel incomplete without her husband and family, and she'll stick with her husband through good and bad no matter what. So this was an interesting one that I read in this book, in the TV show Friends, the matriarch, because it doesn't always have to be a mother. In the TV show Friends, the matriarch is Monica, the person who's like always, organizing everything, making the plans, making sure everyone follows all the rules. So I actually thought for this one, I was thinking about Sarah, because of the way she like manages the house and tells Abraham how things are supposed to go. And just because, when she says something, Hashem says, listen to her. But there's just a kind of way that she is, that she's able to kind of own and manage the house, even though there are other people in the house who have different kinds of power. Another person that I thought for sure fit this characteristic in my mind was Naomi, this way of being the, with her family and owning her family and even, and continuing to be a mother to Ruth even after everything else that happened with her. So the mystic cares about simplicity and loves solitude. She fears being in a large group of people because she's so sensitive, and she feels the emotions of others and is overwhelmed in public places and hates being in the spotlight. So actually, in the movie Frozen, this character, you can see this archetype in Elsa. And I was thinking in Jewish tradition that maybe this was Esther, because we know that she didn't ask for anything when she came into the palace. I think there's some midrashic stories about how, her, even in the text, a certain kind of fear about going to the king and all those kinds of things, that there's a kind of quietness to her and solitude to her that she kind of gets thrust into a different situation. But to me, that seems like her essence. And then the last one is the maiden. The maiden doesn't realize the danger that lurks in the world. She never worries about things, and she feels invulnerable. She hasn't grown up, and she doesn't want to. And she likes being dependent on others and needs to know there's someone there to catch her when she falls. So a good example is Little Red Riding Hood, this sort of child character of like just walking in the park, not really worrying about anything. More recently, I think that in Frozen, we can think of Anna as a very well-developed maiden, someone who doesn't really realize the danger that lurks in the world, but and it kind of keeps this innocent perspective all the way through. In Jewish tradition, I was really struggling to come up with one for the maiden, and I'm open to suggestions. I wondered because we know, I guess I went to, here, so I see comments in the chat. I'm seeing Bathsheba. Oh, Eve. Oh, that's a great idea for the maiden. That's a really good example. I was thinking about Rivka because she was just so young when she came into the house, and because she was always like, you know, sort of younger, and feel like thinking of herself as younger in the relationship with Yitzchak. So cool. I'm glad that this is fun. I hope that you guys will keep thinking about these. It was fun for me and also challenging to kind of start to think about, because I think we think of these, we think of the different characters that we know in various different stories as if they're all different people. But actually, there are these archetypes that kind of flow through stories that we're familiar with. And like I said, whether they come from some sort of collective Jungian philosophy of like the collective unconscious, or whether they're just stories and people that we know that kind of keep repeating for us, there's something to them. And if we keep looking, we'll actually be able to see like, oh, that one really fits in this way. And good authors and authors who work hard to develop their characters often maybe don't use these specific archetypes, but are looking for ways to make characters real, and often find themselves creating these kinds of characters because they're just part of our, whether they're part of our unconscious, they're part of our collective conversation about, you know, how people are developed. And I want to distinguish them from stereotypes. They're really not stereotypes. They can have a tremendous amount of depth. And so some people kind of, you know, get uncomfortable even with Myers-Briggs because they feel like they're being put in boxes. And I think this is way less about putting characters in boxes and more about understanding some of the characters that we resonate with most, and understanding the characters that we understand the best, that we relate to, or that we feel close to, even if they don't reflect us. And understanding, you know, which of the characters are more you know, problematic for us as people. I think understanding that can help us understand character types that we see in the world, and not think of them as just individuals, but think a little bit more in terms of the context that they're coming from more broadly. So, and I just wanted to say about that many times if we find ourselves connecting with a specific feminine character in a book or a movie or television show, it's because that archetype resonates with us in a certain way. And knowing which archetypes speak to us can help us understand ourselves better. And conversely, the lack of deeply developed feminine archetypes in books, movies, and television can keep us from understanding who we are and what gifts we have to offer. So that's why I wanted to share this with you. And this book that I was sharing about also helped me understand there's a difference in feminine and masculine archetypal journeys. Sometimes writers focus on the hero's journey, a hero who goes on an adventure and in a decisive crisis wins a victory and then comes home changed or transformed. And there was recently an opinion article in the New York Times written by a woman called "I Don't Want to Be Your Strong Female Lead." It points out that even though recent Hollywood movies have been incorporating women into lead roles, those roles are still basically masculine stories. It's just that a woman has been cast in a man's story, very similar to what Victoria Schmidt was saying 20 years ago. So it's worth talking a little bit about the difference and exploring the feminine story in more depth so we can own our own stories.
Evonne?
So in the male, yes?
Sorry, I just want to interject for a moment that one of the participants in the Zoom is commenting in the chat box that it's interesting that your personal media choices are based on upper middle class women who don't seem to have a real job or responsibilities. She thinks she's seen Sex in the City and Friends one time each and was completely turned off. She relates better to two broke girls. Molly, I think that's her name. She's a teacher married to a cop. Edith, who's Archie Bunker's wife. They seem to be more real. And I was wondering if you had any feedback on that.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. So the truth is, I am not a huge television watcher. And so I haven't actually, many of the archetypes that I got, I pulled from the book itself, like from this book that I was sharing, because she had defined them. I myself am not, so I used the ones that were familiar to me. I don't watch those TV shows, so I don't really know. I think that Edith, that one, Archie Bunker's wife, I know. I think she's probably a matriarch. But I am not, I'm sorry for the thinness of the examples that I gave. I can work on that. But I think that definitely
because I watch a lot of TV.
Yes. So, but definitely share with me, like the way that Carol did, the different archetypes that you see from television shows that you watch frequently, because I think that it helps to make it real. Those are shows that I am familiar with from a younger stage, but I do think that it helps to make it real, to actually see if these people are connected to characters that you know. And I'm sure that the TV shows that you referenced here are like that you could find archetypes in those characters. Yeah. So please feel free to continue to explore that, including in the chat box.
Just to round this out, Carol's worried that she's tempted us to watch more TV and that it's a bad habit.
Yeah, I don't seem to find that I have a lot of space for that in my life, so it's probably okay. But it's a good thing to remember to broaden out the types of characters being used. Okay, so all right, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between the feminine story and the masculine story, and explore the feminine story in more depth. So in the male journey, and I encourage you to think about your favorite superhero story as I say this. The hero gathers allies or tools and sets out toward a goal. You could also think of the Lord of the Rings, good examples, or a story that you know about, like a male hero. He gathers allies or tools. He sets out toward a goal. If he is victorious, the journey ends with questioning authority and his role in society, and by finding his authentic self. And the hero is given a chance to awaken in the third act toward the end, but he may or may not take that choice. So I'm going to say a lot more about the differences between the masculine and feminine journey as we go through this. So there's also an archetype for the feminine character journey, maybe less well used in blockbuster movies these days, but if you think of any, please put them in the chat. So one really good example that almost everyone knows of the feminine character journey is The Wizard of Oz. So in this story, a woman must go deep inside herself. Her journey starts with questioning authority and her place in the world. She gathers friends, and people help her along the way. She gains the courage to stand up for herself, and she's finally willing to go it alone and faces her own symbolic death. And at the end, she comes back to the beginning to see how far she's come. So modern readers have said the archetype for this story is based on the descent of the ancient Sumerian goddess Inanna into the underworld, one of Western civilization's most ancient stories, though some scholars say that's a bit of a stretch. So from a Jewish perspective, I actually think you might be able to see some of this thread in the story of Esther that we read so recently. So setting aside some of the male-dominated beginning and the end, it's not really a story of male domination and heroism. Different from most other Jewish stories, it's a story of a woman gathering courage, using feminine gifts, claiming her power, and telling her story. So here are some of the differences. I'm going to resume my share. Between the masculine and feminine journey. Here we go. So the masculine journey follows a linear line with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The feminine journey is a circular one that brings the character back to the beginning with deeper wisdom. In the masculine journey, he proves himself to the group, but in the feminine journey, she proves herself to herself. In the masculine journey, he returns at the end to share his rewards with the entire group. He's the one who took the journey for them. But in the feminine journey, she returns to share her experiences with anyone who will listen, and she chooses the next one to go on the journey. He awakens in the end when he realizes his power holds him back from his true feelings. He must let go of self to be awakened. But she awakens at the beginning of the story when she realizes she never had any power, and she comes into self to be awakened. He is told to save and protect women, but she is kept from her journey if she is saved. He is told to provide and be strong. She is told to be passive and receptive. He gets, in the end, the girl, and external rewards. But what she gets is the internal reward of spirit and selfhood. And he needs to trust his abilities, but what she needs to trust is herself and her own instincts. He lives in a world of opportunity, and she lives in the world of danger. Fundamentally, the difference is this. Women come into their power to realize their authentic goals and connectedness, whereas men let go of their power to realize their authentic goals and connectedness. So both journeys are important, and sometimes a male character can take a more feminine journey, and a woman can certainly follow a masculine journey path. But what happens in our culture when one is more valued and more seen than the other? Something important is lost, and not just for women. The Prophetess, the novel that I've written, honors a feminine journey. And Rachel, the main character, is a feminine heroine who uses powers of insight, intuition, and empathy rather than traditional male powers of strength, power, and domination to save the day. The Prophetess is also a story grounded in Jewish traditional wisdom. It includes a community of Jewish prophets, both male and female, expressing their different skills and strengths in a framework of secret prophecy. So to help you understand, so Daphne, do I have time to read something short to the group?
You do, but just one quick question before you do, or maybe after you're reading. Somebody's asking, what do you mean by kept from being on the journey? When you talk about a woman being kept,
what I mean to say, thank you for asking. What I mean to say is that if she's saved, she doesn't take her journey. So he's there to save her. But if she's saved, she never gets to go on the journey. And so we have to, so therefore, in a feminine journey, sometimes it looks like the thing to do is to be saved, but that actually prevents us from the journey that our story takes us on.
Okay, and a follow-up question to that then, are we saying that women are primarily feminine and vice versa?
We are not. So I actually specifically distinguish these as masculine journeys and feminine journeys, not male journeys and female journeys. Because this is not about like the different journeys of men and women, like it can be, but there's a difference in these two different journeys. They have a different kind of path. And if we only see masculine journeys around us, then we don't really get to honor or experience the feminine journey, which resonates strongly for many women, and not every woman. And sometimes men take a feminine journey too. The whole society loses out if we don't have the opportunity to have both.
Thank you.
Okay, so, cool. So to help you understand how this works, I'd like you to read you a scene from my main character, Rachel's first victory. The first time she uses her gifts of prophecy, which are gifts of intuition and insight to save someone. And you might see it's a different kind of saving than a male superhero might perform. And while I read it, I would like to encourage you to think about how it would be different if Rachel were a man or a boy. Okay. Outside, I wandered the streets looking for him. The snow was already half an inch deep on the sidewalk. The frigid wind blew snow into my face, freezing my nose and cheeks. My fingers felt numb inside my gloves. A stream ran along some of the roads in my neighborhood. Wait, I lost my place. That gully where he hid had to be somewhere nearby. Half dazed by the cold, I walked several blocks in one direction before deciding it was the wrong way and turning back. Blinded by my own hot tears, I tripped several times, finally falling and twisting my left wrist. Then I heard a low, terrible groan. I froze, staring around me. "Jake!" I screamed. Where was he? I waited, willing him to moan again. Oh! Then the awful sound of retching and such a long and terrible cry, I ran in his direction. His baseball hat had fallen off. He wore no coat or gloves. His eyes were wide open, his body convulsing in some kind of seizure. I stumbled downhill from the sidewalk to the stream, slipping a little on the snow. His shaking continued, spit and vomit dribbling from his mouth. I doubted he even knew I was there. Ignoring the vomit, I knelt down next to him and grasped his fingers. They were stiff and frighteningly cold, but when I blew warm air onto them, he recoiled. Wincing a little at my sore wrist, I slipped off my gloves and put them on his hands. "Help!" I shouted. There was no answer, only a snowy silence. I was too late. What if he died right here? I thought of that time I'd rescued Chris after his bike accident, knocking on doors until I found someone to help. But I couldn't leave Jake here alone. Hardly thinking, I opened my bag, tossing books and tissues into the snow. At last, my hands closed around my cell phone, and with trembling fingers, I dialed 911. "It's an emergency," I yelled into the phone. When I'd finished giving the details, Jake had stopped shaking. His breath came in shallow gasps. "Jake," I said, stroking his icy face with my cold fingers, "stay with me. I survived only because of you." The words came back to me as if I was dreaming, but this was no dream. Jake lay unconscious, his body slowly being covered by the falling snow. Tears came rushing down my face, defrosting the tears already on my cheeks. "I tried," I said, wiping my tears with my left sleeve so I didn't have to stop stroking his cheek with my right hand. "I tried. Please," I screamed aloud. "Please, please." At last I understood I was praying. "Please, God, let him live, please." I prayed like that until I finally heard sirens approaching in the distance. So I go back to the question of how would this scene be different if Rachel were a boy? What powers does she use that a boy would not use? And what vulnerabilities does she show that a boy would not show? And I encourage you to answer that in the chat box while I walk through some of my own ideas. So, a prophetess is a superhero, uses insights, demonstrates genuine concern. It's coming. Shows vulnerabilities, is nurturing and caring. Shows empathy and real, authentic emotion. Is this moving? And keep writing them in the chat box while this slide makes its way through the end and gets help, practical and spiritual. So a prophetess, a female superhero, those very different things. You can see that you could imagine that if it was a boy, he would never have gotten hurt. Would he have taken the time to put a glove on the cold person? Would he cry? Would he have the insights to know the answers of where the person was? Would he be willing to ask for help and get that help, the help that would make the most difference? So I'm not saying that what a man might do in this kind of situation is not, important, useful, good. But I think we lose something when we don't see superheroes that use these kinds of, traditionally understood to be feminine gifts. And for those of us who have those kinds of gifts, not seeing those kinds of gifts being used and honored and recognized as superhero gifts, as powerful, powerful gifts for us, means we lose something. We lose out on something if we don't see those gifts reflected there. So as women, what does this all mean to us? We have certain strengths, gifts, personality attributes, aspects to our stories that we don't always see in the stories that are told to us. And if we only hear stories of power and domination, we might feel weak if we don't have those strengths, and we might undervalue the gifts that are real for many of us. Gifts like empathy, insight, kindness, nurturing love. And lacking the stories to teach us to own our own power, we might not know how to prove ourselves to ourselves and take the actions that the world needs from us. So I hope this session will help you own your own character, your own stories, honor them in other women, and look for them and even advocate for them in the stories you hear in our culture. So like I said, if these ideas resonate with you, I do encourage you to get a copy of The Prophetess and read it. I worked hard to develop strong feminine characters and stories based on a number of these archetypes, and really trying to make sure that the feminine personality, that the feminine journey was fully developed so that everyone can have that. And like I said, also that it could be grounded in Jewish tradition, something that that our teen girls and all of us who still have a teen girl inside of us can find inspiring, inspiring as it relates to Judaism, and inspiring as it relates to who we are as women. So I'd love to hear what you think after you read the book, and I'd be happy to answer questions either now or later. Here's my email address and my website with lots more information. And I think in the chat box, there's a link to how to get the book, but you also encourage you to go get it at your library. So at this point, I think I'm ready to see if there are any more questions or if we're good.
I have a question. First of all, thank you. That was amazing. Actually, before I get to my question, I have another question here that was texted to me. What type of archetype do you think modern Jewish women are cast in, regardless of what they actually are? Do you think that they're the maiden, the nurturer, the matriarch?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think they're unfortunately often cast as a matriarch. The sort of like, one of the things that I read about that character trait is sort of like the unforgiving mother-in-law. That's one of the sort of attributes of the matriarch, and I think that unfortunately Jewish women are cast that way. I think that so that's the one that most comes to mind. What do you think, Daphne?
Oh, probably the matriarch, I think. I don't know. Like
I think
before,
when
you opened it up and you were like, "Which one?" I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, when you opened up the question and you asked, "Which one do we most identify with?" And I, at first, like the first two that came to mind are the matriarch and the nurturer. And then as I read through, I was like, sometimes I'm a little bit of that, and sometimes I'm a little bit of that, and sometimes even a little bit of that. So I think some of it is situational for modern Jewish women, and I think that's the gift and the burden of being a modern Jewish woman, is that we have to adapt.
I think that's true. I mean, I don't even know if that's just exclusive to Jewish women. I mean, I think that a lot of working women sort of find themselves being pushed into a father's daughter role, where they have to be able to, compete or, somehow be better than other women, or like, be thought of as respected by men. And I think that a lot of professional situations sort of push women into that situation. So I do certainly think, I mean, there were, like I said, when I originally said, like, kind of jump down, which ones speak to you, I think that it's probably more than one. And I think that that's fine. And I do think you're right that in different kinds of roles, we sometimes have to pull a different part of ourselves out. In stories, it's easier because you're describing someone in their particular, within their box. And I think that a woman who we might be able to define in our own mind when we look at her as a matriarch in real life, to herself might think of herself in a different way, or there might be other roles that she's taking that are, different. But in stories, we can fully explore one sort of particular attribute of a person, and it helps us all understand that attribute of ourselves better.
Thanks. So my other question was, I found it interesting that you opened it up with all of these interesting nonfiction books, inspirational books, books of quotes, and you found that each of them had a nugget here and there, and you still have some of them, but you ended up writing a fictional story and not your own kind of nonfiction inspiration. I'm wondering if that's coming down the pike, or if you found something in the years since that have kind of filled that void.
Well, actually, that's not quite, I mean, the truth is that the stories that I was reading that I was most drawn by, especially when I was young, like, as a teenager, I'm going back to that screen so that I can show it to you. Mm-hmm. So if you look at these stories, so actually many of them are stories. So The Alchemist, The Celestine Prophecy, and Siddhartha are three books that had a really strong influence on me. And they all have the common thread of being a wisdom story that comes in the form of a story. And that to me has always been very compelling. How you can, because I think as human beings, we really resonate with stories. Stories touch us in ways that like books about philosophy just don't. And although I was, searching and reading all different kinds of things, those books, the stories that really reached people by, helping them relate to the characters were the ones that spoke the most to me. And when I started out to write this book, I thought, I wish that there were a book like The Celestine Prophecy that was like Jewish, that was coming from a Jewish place. And where, it was this, because that is a novel. And it's an adventure story, but it's basically a story where like all along the way, you're like picking up little pieces of wisdom. And that was my hope. And I hope that I've achieved that, to write a book where you're inspired by the story. You're also kind of having fun with the story. And in the end, you've maybe learned something along the way, but the learning of the something wasn't like the only reason that you would ever read that book. And it wouldn't be like a book like The Tao Te Ching is hard work. But a novel can be fun and engaging. And that's really what I was wishing for when I was a teenager.
Will there be a sequel?
I hope so. My publisher reminds me that I have to sell this one first.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and for providing us with this wealth of really interesting information. It's going to make me look at both my teams, and I'm happy to sit down and talk about other TV characters or movie characters. And really, thank you so much, Evonne. I really appreciate it. I don't know if you have any last thoughts before we sign off.
I just invite you to pay attention to the stories and characters that you're seeing, especially the way women are portrayed, and notice how people are developing or not fully developing female characters, and where the feminine stories lie that really inspire you and that you resonate with as a woman, and not feel like you have to be bound by the male stories that seem to be so prevalent. We really have an opportunity to own our own stories by seeing that there are different kinds of stories that might resonate more with us, and by living into those stories. And I hope that helps you to grow into your particular stories and gifts.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night and stay healthy.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.